Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. I'm joined, as I am every week, by Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back for another week of the Libertarian Angle.
It's good to be with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yes, I noticed, Richard, that rather than the normal backdrop that you use, you're sitting in a room where a lot of weights are. Now, don't tell me that you use those weights, because I can tell you don't.
Now, you see, viewers and listeners, what I have to put up with. And I've been accepting this for decades. Abuse, sarcasm, but for the cause of liberty, I endure it. Okay. Well, okay. So to not confuse you, I'm not at home and I'm not at my office at the Citadel. My wife and I are here in New York, in Westchester County, to spend the week to celebrate Thanksgiving with our family. And this is our son-in-law's sort of work area. I'm at his desk, but he also does some weightlifting to stay in shape. And I'm just exhausted looking at them in a stationary pose. That's all I can say.
Yeah, because, you kind of remind me of that old...
Watch it.
When we were growing up as kids, when there was the comic books where they'd have those advertisements for Charles Atlas bodybuilding, and you remind me of the guy on the beach that would get sand kicked in his face. Sorry, Richard.
If I believed in statism, I would demand that there be regulations on you.
All right, let's get on to business. Let's talk about democracy, and democracy in the context of freedom. Because, we've got all this hullabaloo with the presidential election and the congressional elections, and you see the mainstream pundits saying that this shows how a free society works, and there's going to be a peaceful transition of power, and that this is all freedom. And of course, as libertarians, Richard, we know that that's absolute nonsense. That democracy is not freedom, right?
Right. Yes, absolutely. The ambiguity that has arisen, that we often view freedom as democracy and democracy as freedom, originated, unfortunately, in that Enlightenment era of the Age of Reason of the second half of the 1700s, the 18th century. Perhaps I could sort of explain it in the following way. If you read the Declaration of Independence, it is clear that the Founding Fathers believe in a self-governing people. But what does self-governing mean? Now, on the one hand, it's clear that for our Founding Fathers, self-government certainly included the right of the citizens to vote on the appointment of representatives who would hold public and political office for a certain period of time. That this was considered far superior. The people themselves determining who shall rule over them in the political arena than the absolute monarch, who by accident of birth is given unrestrained political power and control over the subjects as opposed to the citizens. And certainly, in the broad sense of a free society, that sense of a self-governing and free people is essential. But it is also clear, at least to me, and I think to many other historians of economic ideas and social and political ideas, that when the Founding Fathers talked about a self-governing people, they meant it at a more deeper level, and that is the self-governing individual. The very idea in the Declaration of Independence, where it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This means that each individual is to have self-ownership over himself, self-governing power over himself. It is his life to direct and guide as he thinks best for his purpose, his goals, for his sense of a meaning for his life, and to pick the means most appropriate to achieve the goals and purposes and meanings for himself. At the same time, besides that, the idea that the individual would make his decisions in liberty as to how to use his physical abilities, his mental abilities, and pursue happiness as he defines it. That is, each and every one of us are sovereign individuals who then associate with other sovereigns, that is, other free individuals, on the basis of voluntary consent and free agreement. That is the more fundamental notion, I would argue, of freedom. Democracy is merely one of the ancillary or auxiliary institutional mechanisms that should reinforce that more primary notion of freedom and self-government, and assure that the individual is not encroached upon either by private individuals who would violate his liberties or by a government that would do so. The ambiguity arose in that other place where a call for liberty and democracy emerged around the same time, and that was in France. And the perversity here arose with the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his famous work on the social contract. He said that man in a state of nature had absolute freedom, but it was chaotic, it was uncertain of safety for himself, and he then enters into society, and he gives up his personal liberty for protection. But beyond that, he then talks about a general will, the will of the people as a whole. And that while individuals can err or make mistakes about what is good for them and others, the people as a whole, the general will, cannot err or make mistakes or be misdirected. And that, in fact, the individual, for this reason, must be subservient or obedient or following to this greater sense of the public good, the general welfare, the national interest, as representing the general will of the people as a whole. Now, in that sense, then democracy becomes freedom. How do we see a reflection, a representation, a manifestation of the general will of the people as a whole? Well, the only avenue left open is some representative process of where the people vote, and they elect those who represent them and speak for them and enforce what they, the people, would want. And since it is the will of the people, each individual must accept unswervingly what the general will, that is, those who have voted and elected in a majority sense, have dictated as to be good and desirable and, dare I say, progressive for the society as a whole. Now, if one takes that notion of democracy as a representation of the will of the people, as the freedom of the people, then what you see are all the disasters, tragedies, and hardships that we have experienced in certainly the Western world, but the world in general, for the last 200 years since then. Because then what one sees here is someone like the communists who say that they know what is in the interest of the entire society and that they're a true democracy representing the general will, even if individuals suffer from a false consciousness and don't understand their right and correct interest. Or the Nazis, for example, that the general will is a manifestation of the race blood of the people, and that those who speak most purely for it must be in charge to guide the people, while individuals may suffer from misdirections, misunderstandings, and confusions about what the racial calling of their people demands of them. And most recently, in the West, we see this with democratic politics, the idea that democracy represents, again, the will of the people. We see this in this recent election. Now, what has been the outcome? It turns out that as the remainder of the votes have been counted in places like California and a few other close races, it appears that Hillary Clinton will have won the popular vote. By the last number I saw late last week, was at least by 1.5 million votes compared to Donald Trump. But Trump clearly has been elected president through the Electoral College, which is part of our constitutional structure of representative government. Now, what is the complaint? What is the complaint of those who feel that they have lost and been betrayed in this election? that the will of the people has been denied, that the people as the majority have spoken, and all others in the society must accept that, regardless of what that person's policies and that person's agenda or that person's notion of freedom may be, to which all must then submit. Now, the fact is that notion of democracy, of the general will as a majority, whether a literal majority or a supermajority, is denial of freedom as the Founding Fathers understood it, as I explained a couple of minutes ago, and the idea of the self-governing individual. Because what they want is the majority to dictate policy over all others. Now, this is not meant to be a defense of Donald Trump. We have talked about Donald Trump, his attitudes, his beliefs, his proposed policies on our show many times before. And I think any listener and viewer knows that neither Jacob nor I have any sympathy or confidence in his own form of the interventionist welfare state agenda that he seems clearly to have in mind, including a regulation and protectionism. But nonetheless, those who reject Trump are doing so because they have this idea that merely because a majority has supported a candidate, that candidate must be elected and be put in power to determine the policies for all of us. The very purpose of a constitutional government is to enumerate the limited and essential functions that the government has responsibility to perform, no more and no less, precisely to secure the individual's freedom. That is the idea and the ideal behind our constitutional structure, and it is perverted and distorted and weakened whenever we presume that the democratic will is the expression of freedom. Freedom is individual liberty, individual rights, voluntary association, and constrained policing power to secure liberty and not to violate it.
Yeah, you make some excellent points. I especially like the idea of analyzing the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence in the same context. But I think it's impossible to look at one without looking at the other. Ludwig von Mises pointed out that the only real benefit of a democratic system is that it provides for a peaceful transition of power. That when people's opinions change or they want new people in office, there doesn't have to be a coup, there doesn't have to be a revolution. They can simply vote people in that reflect these new views. But it's a dangerous system. I mean, there's no question about it, a democratic system is, because, they can elect a Hitler. And in fact, the Nazi Party garnered lots of votes back in the 1930s. And so in Latin America, there's a popular saying that they have the freedom, in quotation marks, to elect their dictator every 4 years. Well, in a sense, that's really what's happened to the United States. And that then gets us back to what freedom is. And that's the point that you were making, is that freedom is different from just the right to vote. Freedom is much more profound than that. It involves the right to live your life the way you want, no matter but your conduct is irresponsible or immoral. As long as your conduct's peaceful, you should be free to do whatever you want. So you have a right to accumulate unlimited amounts of wealth. If you're genuinely free, you have to decide what to do with that. You have the right to decide what to do with your own money, donate to charity or not, go to church or not, engage in economic enterprise freely without government interference. So these are all the aspects of what defines a free individual. Well, what happens if you elect a person that says, I'm going to force you to go to church. I'm going to take away your money and force you to give it to the poor and the needy. I'm going to regulate your economic activity. So what the founders did and the framers did is they said, okay, we have an answer for that. Well, certainly people have fundamental rights, but we're going to have a government that's being called into existence by this charter called the Constitution that is going to limit the powers. And if the power is not enumerated, then it doesn't exist, and the powers are very few. But the American people, for them, that didn't trust government, that even that wasn't good enough. They said, no, we want a Bill of Rights, a Bill of Prohibitions that says you don't have the power to interfere with freedom of speech and freedom of religion and due process of law. And if you're going to do bad things to us, you have to follow certain procedures like grand jury indictments and due process and no illegal searches and seizures and no cruel and unusual punishments. All of this idea being that, yes, we will elect whoever's going to be president or members of Congress, but once you're elected, you can't take away our freedom. You don't wield the power to take away our freedom. Your powers are tightly constrained in a tight little band to do what we consider as legitimate, like punish murderers and rapists or protect the nation from an invasion. But clearly, Richard, we've gone way beyond that. I mean, we've elected a man that has the power to assassinate Americans, to torture Americans through his national security establishment, the power through Congress to use the IRS to take people's money. They could, I mean, theoretically, they could raise the percentage up to 90% of income taxes. And there's not anything anybody could do about it because it's a democratic system. Well, our position as libertarians is no, a democratic system, in order to protect freedom, has to have restraints on power. And that's what that Constitution and Bill of Rights is all about.
Absolutely. I have mentioned more than once in some articles that I've written over the years, including for FFF, about what it means to be an American, a citizen. And I've often used the example of my own wife, who is originally from the Soviet Union, Russia. And after coming to the United States and the designated period of time waiting for eligibility for citizenship, she became a citizen. And she took that oath of allegiance of becoming a United States citizen. Now, you reject all allegiances to foreign powers and potentates and so on. But the core of it is that you give an allegiance to protect the Constitution of the United States. Now, if you look at the Constitution, in essence is an organizational chart. It represents the duties and responsibilities of the executive branch, the legislative branch, Congress, and the judicial branch, so the Supreme Court. Now, why would a person becoming a citizen of the United States take an oath of allegiance to an organizational chart concerning administrative responsibilities of three branches of government? Because that can only be understood in the context of why the Founding Fathers finally wrote and then implemented that Constitution. And it was to secure and protect the philosophical principles that were articulated and defended in the Declaration of Independence. That's precisely as you just said, Jacob. That's why you want and need a Constitution that is clearly and definitely and precisely constructed and written with checks and balances and limits, because its purpose is to restrain government from what? From the interfering with the self-governing citizens, individual citizens of the country, to live their lives as they choose, peacefully and freely, in voluntary association with their neighbors, both next door or in another part of their own country or with those around the world. That is the purpose of a constitution. Otherwise, why bother with a constitution? Either have a dictator or just have unrestrained democratic decision-making where any minority, whether that minority be 49% or 1%, be just trodden over by what the majority have wanted.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, you know, they could have called into existence a government whereby people said whoever we elect will have the power to do whatever he thinks is in the best interest of the country. And then we're going to trust him with that kind of power. Now, they didn't do that. And it really goes to the heart of what freedom really means. That does it, in other words, if a president wields the power to kill you whenever he wants, even though he's not exercising that power, even though through 3 years of his term, he hasn't killed one single person. That doesn't mean that's a free society. Because as the framers understood, it's not just whether the power is being exercised, it's does he wield the power to do these things. And if a president wields the power to assassinate you, even though it's not being exercised, even though he doesn't have the concentration camp set up, everybody's got to factor that into his decision-making, that he can't fall too much out of line because he knows that the president, with his national security establishment, has the power to assassinate him. It has the power to conduct secret surveillance on him, try to discover secrets in his life that they can blackmail him with. Everybody now has to conform to the notion of this omnipotent power. Now, let me digress a minute. You know that I've written for many years now of how the national security establishment, the National Security Act of 1947, fundamentally altered America's governmental structure for the worse. Because here we have this pretense that we have limited government in America. I mean, you can go to any conservative conference and the conservatives will be saying, oh, we have limited government. Well, you've got an agency called the CIA that has unlimited power. I mean, they have the power to do whatever they want. They go into other countries and they kidnap people, they assassinate people, and as long as they say we were doing this as part of a national security operation, the Justice Department won't touch them, the federal courts won't touch them, Congress won't touch them. They have omnipotent power. Well, how can you have a limited government when you have one agency that has unlimited power? That's all you need is one agency to have unlimited power. And let me give you one more example of this entire phenomenon here of democracy and freedom in the national security state. In Chile in 1970, the Chilean people elected Salvador Allende, who was a self-proclaimed socialist, a member of the Communist Party in Chile, and he won a plurality of the votes, and so it got thrown into the Congress of Chile, and he was elected. The national security establishment here and the national security advisors, the National Security Council headed by Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, said, we can't allow the Chilean voters to be this irresponsible. We need to go and oust that man from power. Now, we'd all agree that, a socialist, a communist, you're not going to have a free society. But yet, Richard, I would argue that's for the Chilean people to figure out. That if they'd been left alone, maybe they discover through trial and error the benefits of a constitution, of a limited government, of an independent judiciary, that you leave it to people to figure these things out because they're not easy to figure out. We see the same thing happening in Venezuela, where the Maduro is the elected president. He's a socialist. He's thrown the country into chaos. But that's for the Venezuelan people to figure out. And so by having a CIA that went in there and had this horrible coup and installed the Pinochet regime that turned out to be a reign of terror, you can see what happens when you have a government that has an agency of unlimited power, and you see the dangers, again, in those countries of a country where you have democracy but no limitations on power.
Right, and there's also the fact is that this identification of democracy equaling freedom sends a naive shock through those in the modern American sense of the liberal elite establishment. The United States decides to invade Iraq. They're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein. They're going to cleanse the world of a terrible tyrant. And then what's going to happen is that in short order, the Iraqi people will now have the opportunity to express their will in a free democratic process. And how did the Washington elite react when the will of the Iraqi people were expressed? And it was seen that they didn't want women to be running for office. They wanted to limit women being able to hold positions, that it ended up being a factionalism of different sectarian groups of the Islamic faith, all of whom were interested in crushing the other and using the power of the state for their both religious and earthly and material desires. They were shocked that something has gone wrong, but no, the will of the people spoke. And the problem is that sometimes minorities and majorities believe in views and values and policies that have very little to the notion of freedom in the proper sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think the founding fathers really had it right. I mean, they said, look, let's have a limited government republic here in America. It will not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And that's John Quincy Adams' famous speech. There's going to be a lot of bad things happening around the world. Dictators, including democratically elected dictators.
Right.
They're going to have famines and tyranny. But this government's not going to go abroad with a military force to fix those things, to save those people, in large part because it will end up destroying our own freedom. And there's that famous quote by Madison saying, of all the enemies to liberty, war is the biggest, because it encompasses all the threats to liberty: out of control spending, centralization of power. And yet that's what we have now. We have unlimited government going abroad, invasions, coups, and whatever, and partly to oust people that have been democratically elected, like in Egypt, where they had an election and they elected, quote, the wrong person in the eyes of U.S. officials. And so now the U.S. is supporting this military dictatorship over there. And then the founders said, we're going to build a model society of freedom here where the private sector is unleashed. The American people are unleashed to travel around the world. There weren't even passports. Americans could just travel with no passports. There was open borders. There was free, well, not total free trade. There was some protectionism. But the concept was Americans can go abroad and buy and sell and so forth. That's really the ideal, Richard, when we're talking about a free society. It's different what the interventionists and the statists want. They want to isolate the private sector and unleash the government to continue invading and intervening. We want to do the opposite. We want to limit the government and unleash the private sector to interact with the people of the world.
Yes, because today, where democracy equals freedom, the notion is that the elected government, as long as it represents in some defined way the will of the people, it has unlimited authority to, as you said, go fight wars abroad, to surveillance individuals in other countries as well as the citizens of the home country, to intrude into their personal affairs, to have the authority to seize their property without due process of law. In fact, to make people totally submissive and subservient to the needs of the state, the national interest. Because what is the national interest in this conception? It is the will of the people as reflected in the policies implemented by those elected into office. Now, sometimes this comes back to bite you where the sun don't shine. And what do I mean by that? The liberals and the Democrats, and I'm using liberal in the modern sense, the liberals and the Democrats are horrified of the idea that Donald Trump may come into the White House starting in January and through executive power proceed to do things that they are horrified about the possibility of. But who has implemented more executive acts than virtually any other president? It is already in the short 21st century, but even looking back before that, Barack Obama. Did any of them object when the president went beyond his constitutional authorities and limits of having to reach agreements legislatively with the Congress, when he said that he had a phone in one hand and a pen in the other and he would do anything that he wanted? No, they loved it because he was following the progressives' agenda. Now, they suddenly discover that that type of centralized power in one man is a two-edged sword. And when someone gets in that is not your choice, what is then the consequence? He can now wield the same power that you admired and desired and wanted, but in ways that will be exactly the opposite. And you will now feel like the victim rather than all those that you had no problem victimizing because your man was in office.
Yeah, you and I have always emphasized that don't entrust power with anybody that you would imagine would be your worst enemy. And because once you do that, because you like the person, he's your man in office or your woman in office, then all of a sudden your worst fear materializes. Your enemy becomes the president and now wields the same omnipotent powers. And your point about war is excellent because the founding fathers, the framers, had a provision for that too. They said we don't trust the president with war, with the power to wage war, and therefore we want the matter of determining whether to go to war to be in the hands of Congress. And that's what the Declaration of War requirement was about. Well, who follows that? No president follows it. And the Democrats, when their man's in office, they love it when Barack Obama's intervening in Syria or Yemen or assassinating people abroad. But now Donald Trump has the power to send the entire nation into war without congressional consent. So yeah, it's sort of boomeranging back on them.
That shows the necessity for us to redouble our efforts to help explain to so many of our fellow citizens for whom this is a bit beclouded in their minds about what freedom means and why it refers to the individual rights and liberty of each and every sovereign individual, and not giving unlimited power to someone in the White House or even to Congress, because Congress itself may make its own decisions. But the point is, its decisions, too, are to be limited to the enumerated functions in the Constitution. It doesn't matter whether it's congressional despotism or executive despotism or even judicial despotism. All of this are meant to be restrained, limited, and used as shields to protect each individual to be the free sovereign person that the Founding Fathers originally had in mind.
On that excellent note, Richard, we'll wrap it up for the week. I want to wish all our viewers and you, Richard, a happy Thanksgiving, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.
And please accept my good wishes for the Thanksgiving holiday as well. See you next time. Bye-bye.